So is New York becoming more of a no state over fears of liability costs? The folks at the Lawsuit Reform Alliance say that is the case and that it's only getting worse.
We hear stories all the time about schools that no longer have balls at recess, schools that have shut down their swings at recess because they're scared of lawsuits and litigation. In an extreme example in Saratoga, the school canceled recess altogether in the winter because they were worried some kid might slip.
All right, joining me now to talk more about this and other liability issues is the man from that video, Tom Stebbins. He's the executive director of the Lawsuit Reform Alliance. Tom, thanks very much for joining me. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Nick.
So, no balls at recess. What's going on here?
Yeah, no balls at recess. We've got schools that are canceling recess altogether in the winter, and oftentimes they say it's due to safety, but the real issue here is liability. And the problem is we have so many laws in state government that expand the liability to schools, to libraries, to municipalities, to such a degree that schools and other public institutions are taking drastic measures to try to cut down their liability costs.
And this is something that's institutional. It's built into the law that they've got these liability concerns that they're really responding to.
That's right. Probably the biggest law is the issue of joint and several liability. And that's the idea that a public institution or an individual can be held 100% liable even if they were only 1% at fault. So if you have, say, for example, a ball at recess, the school could be held 100% liable even if the ball, in this particular case, was only 1% at fault.
Let's back up a little bit. In lawsuits, whenever they're doling out damages or what have you, or trying to make a settlement, there's usually various parties who are considered to be at fault, and then they say, well, this party is at 10% fault, this party is at 30% fault, and that's how they figure out who pays out damages, right?
Correct.
And that's what we're talking about.
Correct. Here. But the problem is it becomes really the hunt for the solvent bystander. So you have, and oftentimes that solvent bystander is the municipality or the school or
the richest entity.
Exactly.
Available.
So if there's a car accident, say, somebody, or let's say there's a biking accident, somebody will sue the person that hit them, but then they'll also sue the city in which it occurred, the town in which it occurred, the town DPW, the highway department, the village DPW. They sue everybody they possibly can because if they can prove that 1%, then they can collect the full amount of the judgment.
In that video, you used the example of the Saratoga Springs School District, I think. How much is this costing school districts statewide? Not just lawsuits, but just the concerns over liability in general, because obviously they've got to pay a lot in insurance for things like this.
Sure. Well, the costs are over $1 billion for municipalities and schools and our public entities. Upstate, downstate, New York City spent, I think, $730 million last year, another record after another record year before that. And that $730 million represents more than New York City spends on parks, libraries, and aging combined. It's a huge figure, and it's money that could really be spent better.
So what can be done legislatively? How can this be changed?
Well, first thing we should do is enact fair share liability so that parties are held responsible for what they're liable for, or held liable for what they're responsible for. So if you were 20% responsible for the injury, you should be held 20% liable for the injury. Now, there's an exception to that. If you're more than 50%, then sure, you can pay the whole judgment. But that's called fair share liability. Pennsylvania recently enacted it. We can enact it here as well. Another major issue is the issue of trespassers. Now, many people know that in the state of New York, if somebody's trespassing on your property and injures themselves, you can be held liable for that.
Right.
And that's nowhere more problematic than with schools and with public institutions. People breaking into parks and schools late at night and injuring themselves. And I think perhaps most notoriously is the case of Senator Jim Alisi breaking in and suing one of his constituents.
Right.
And frankly,
which a lawsuit that he did drop after I think he was publicly shamed for it.
Correct.
Right.
But actually that case was part of the reason for the creation of my organization. It was in the aftermath of that folks said, boy, we can't fix this. It's one of those only in New York laws. We really need a group dedicated to trying to reform these things.
To take devil's advocate for a second here.
Please do.
Is this making it harder? Is the ultimate goal here just to make it harder for people who are injured in accidents to sue?
Absolutely not. If you've been injured and somebody's been negligent, then absolutely they should pay. But what we're trying to do is prevent people who aren't negligent from paying the full amount. That's the real issue, so that we don't have people unjustly paying for things that they weren't responsible for.
I know you guys have raised concerns about the influence of the trial lawyers in state government. But how did we get to this point where the system, from your guys' point of view, has been so out of whack on this? Has it been just a series of laws that have been passed, regulations, things like that,
yeah,
based
absolutely.
on their influence?
The control of the trial lawyers is hugely problematic, and that's part of the reason why New York is one of the most litigious places in the most litigious country in the world. And New York City spends more per capita on lawsuits than just about any other place in the world. It is really because of the influence of the trial bar, the preventing minor reforms like fair share liability, and also enacting new ways to expand liability. Those have been part of the problem and part of the reason we continue to see these record costs against our municipalities, record lawsuits against our municipalities and public institutions.
Did you see much in the way of tort reform at all, lawsuit reform, this past legislative session? I mean, obviously probably the most powerful trial lawyer in the state was Shelley Silver at the beginning of the year, and he's no longer Assembly Speaker. I know you guys earlier this year actually pointed out that maybe now could be a potential time for this now that he's replaced.
Right.
But did we see
and then we had issues in the Senate.
Right.
So
and then
things were a little chaotic
Good
this
point.
session.
Fair enough. But did we see any progress on the issue?
We saw a lot of progress actually in the court system, specifically in the aftermath of the Sheldon Silver case. The asbestos court system in the city was probably one of the most that was at the center of that scandal. Right. And we've seen judges stepping down. We've seen cases get remitted. And we've also seen, shockingly, that court had priority access for whites in Luxembourg, which they've ended. So a lot of those changes have happened at the courts level. It takes a little bit longer on the legislative side, especially with the Senate undergoing similar chaos.
Just getting back to the issue of municipalities before I let you go, Tom. Local governments have long complained about mandates, about spending imposed on governments. Have you guys been working at all with some of the local government advocates in Albany to alleviate some of these concerns? I mean, the mandates that we think of, typically on doing reporting on this, it's like, healthcare costs, pension costs, Medicaid, things like that. But have you been working with local government advocates on this issue as well? Absolutely.
We've worked with the Conference of Mayors and we've worked with the Association of Towns. We've worked with these kind of municipal groups on medical liability, because there's obviously a lot of medical costs, because there's obviously a lot of liability costs there, but also on things like the scaffold law, which people might not think of as a mandate, but is definitely a mandate that's driving up costs of building and construction that our municipalities undertake.
Looking ahead to 2016, do you see any opportunity for that to be addressed at all next year?
Absolutely. I think the time is well past due, and I think people are really optimistic for change.
All right, Tom Stebbins, Lawsuit Reform Alliance, thanks very much for your time, sir. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.